There we go. So this month's speaker is a professor from Jacksonville University in Florida, and a nationally, maybe more than nationally recognized expert on the American robin, having authored the species account for American robin on the Birds of the World project that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In addition to her research on robins, she's also worked with cardinals. She also has research ongoing on the Margay, a tropical wildcat species in Ecuador. She's very involved not only in her university, but in the larger Jacksonville community with some sort of outreach and education programs like the Science on Tap, kind of broadcasting new information about science to people around Jacksonville. So that is our speaker, Professor Natasha Richardson of Jacksonville. And Natasha, I will turn it over to you to do the rest.
Thank you guys for having me. I hope you all are nice and warm up there. I'm freezing my butt off down here in Florida, so I can only imagine how cold it is up where you guys are. Thank you all for having me. I wish I was there in person. I think we're all kind of sick of these Zoom meetings and of everything COVID has brought us. And that's one reason why I titled my talk, Hope Springs Eternal. I really think the robin is a great example of a bird that can help connect us with nature and hopefully give us all a little bit about hope in what lately has seemed like a kind of a dismal future. COVID has been tough on all of us. It's no fun. I think we're all sick of it. But if anything good has come out of COVID, I think more people are into birds. And in my opinion, that is always a good thing. So, and I really think the robin is just a great example of a bird that can really connect people and kind of be that, I hate to use this term, but kind of like the gateway drug into the world of birding. There was a book written several years ago by John Young, and he talked about using the robin kind of as a model organism. You know, if you just sit down and watch the robin, you can learn a little bit more about nature, about how it interacts with nature. So I recommend that book if you haven't checked it out. And also the robin is just the perfect bird for little kids to get involved. And I don't know if you guys have a youth chapter or not, but you know, kids are naturally curious. And if there's a perky, fun bird out there to watch, it's the robin. I mean, the way they forage along the ground and scoop their head down and tilt their head, they're just really fun and energetic birds. And it's a great bird, I think, for a lot of us, if we aren't connected to nature, to reconnect with nature. So hopefully robins will give us hope in this day and age. So that's why I titled my talk. Hopefully it will be hopeful for you guys. So you guys all know what robins look like, so I won't spend too much time on this. Of course, I'm a bit biased, but I think they're one of the most gorgeous birds out there. Many people might think they're kind of dull in color because they're kind of grayish on the back, but they've got that beautiful chest, and the males, their head's nice and dark. And even the females, that slate gray that covers their body, I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And I just love their little beaks, and it looks like the tips of their beak. It's like they never clean it off when they're finished foraging. It's always kind of dirty there on the tip. And of course, juvenile robins, like many thrush species, they have that speckled chest, which helps keep them safe probably from predators. So just showing you some pictures of what robins look like. One of the great things about robins is you can find them everywhere. They range across most of North America. Down here in Florida, unfortunately, sadly to say, we only get them here in the winter in large foraging flocks. But through most of North America, and many times throughout much of the year, you can enjoy the robin. And robins, of course, their scientific name is Turdus migratorius, and they're known for being highly migratory. This is a great visualization from eBird. I know you guys were talking about eBird a second ago, and eBird's just got some great tools out there. And one of their tools is you can kind of visualize the distribution and spread of birds throughout the year. So we know birds migrate throughout the year for breeding and to find food resources. Of course, robins will move far north in the spring and summertime for breeding, and then they'll move back down south in the winter. And this is where we tend to find them in high numbers down here in Florida, where I am. But of course, a lot of birds are kind of changing how they move throughout the United States because of climate change and habitat alteration. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about, and once again, I am totally biased, so I'm just going to start my presentation that way. But I think robins are amazing, and they've just adapted so well to every bit of crap we've kind of thrown at them. We've basically made a perfect home for robins, and I really think robins, no matter what we do, I think they're going to figure out a way to live and survive and be really successful. So hopefully by the end of the talk, I will have given you some examples, not only from my research, but from other folks' research about how robins just adapt to everything we do. So first, we'll talk a little bit about migration. As I said, this is kind of what their scientific name comes from, Turdus migratorius. And robins, even though we kind of think of them as the bird of spring, you know, when you hear that lovely chiroo, 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 chiroo sound, you know spring is in the air. But robins are kind of shifting how they migrate due to climate change, but also because we are changing our habitat overall. So that's the first thing I want to kind of talk about. Many birds, not just robins, are shifting their range, and we're seeing this with robins. So this is an article from Minnesota saying that you're finding them in Minnesota, even when you didn't find them in Minnesota, and you're finding them moving north earlier and earlier, likely due to climate change. This is a paper that came out a couple years ago from David Brown and EKU, or Eastern Kentucky University, and he was one of the first to really kind of study robin migratory patterns. And it seems like totally strange that this most abundant bird that we have out there, that we don't know a lot about its migratory patterns. But it is true that we still haven't figured everything out about how these birds migrate. So he looked at banding data and tried to kind of track about, well, where are these birds going? Are they highly connected to their migratory grounds? And he found a couple of patterns. Most of the birds on the eastern side of the United States stick to the eastern side, and most of the birds on the western side kind of stick to the western side. Also, there seems to be kind of pretty tight connectivity. So birds, they tend to migrate to the same place year after year. And we do see some differences in patterns between males and females. And one really interesting thing that he found that I was interested in is that not all the birds are migrating. A lot of birds are staying put. And you see these with these solid dots here, both the red and the blue, indicating differences between males and females. So some birds just aren't going anywhere like they used to. They're just sticking around. They aren't migrating at all. This is a study that came out just last year and was looking at migratory arrival dates with American robins. And like many birds, they tend to be migrating earlier. So they looked at this data, and what their data shows by seeing when robins fly over is that each decade they're arriving approximately 5 days earlier. So we see these shifts in robins' behavior as far as when they are migrating. And some birds are not migrating at all. And climate change probably is one reason for this. And there was this great study that just came out. Some of you guys might be familiar with it, Audubon study, where they looked at breeding bird survey data and Christmas bird count survey data, and they plugged it into a large climate model, and they tried to predict, well, what's going to happen to a lot of birds in North America with warming temperatures. And you can check out this web page and you can type in a bird's name, and it'll kind of tell you these maps, a prediction about what their range is going to look like. Is it going to be gained? Is it going to be lost? Or is it going to be maintained? And this is from the model of 3 degrees Celsius increase. So if we don't do anything and things get kind of out of hand. And so here we've got the range in summer, and you can see throughout much of the US, they're going to lose their range. And I think these higher temperatures are probably going to spark more wildfires, which will obviously be bad for them. And also the heat. If it gets too hot, many nestling birds may not survive as well. But on the flip side, the winter range of where the robin is found is probably going to be largely maintained. As we said, their range might shift slightly northward, and they might even gain more range up in parts of Canada. So the robin is changing to things that we are changing in our environment already, moving slowly northward. Some are not even migrating. And scientists are still trying to figure this out. There's currently a graduate student, Emily Williams, and I want to say she's at Georgetown, and she is doing a massive study on robin migration. I can't wait till she finishes with it, because she is actually looking at robins from everywhere and doing all sorts of analyses to really try and crack what's going on with robin migration. Of course, robins have been dealing with humans changing the habitat for a really, really long time. If you think about robins, they're kind of open woodland specialists. And well, we've created a lot of open areas for them ever since the colonists came in. Of course, much of the eastern United States was covered with forests. Of course, now it's not covered with forests, and we continue to manipulate the environment and change it. Fortunately, we're changing it into, I guess a robin utopia might be a good word for it. These beautiful expansive lawns, great trees, great nesting sites, you name it. Our backyards have it for robins.
Hey, Natasha, there's sort of a lot of chatter going on, people having trouble hearing.
Okay.
I think it may be your internet signal kind of or something, but yeah, some people are thinking maybe if you're a little closer to the microphone, they're having a little trouble hearing you.
My microphone.
I don't know that that's the problem, because I'm noticing the volume changes aren't like you're not moving, but the volume is changing. So it may be more of a internet issue, but just in case that helps.
I'll try and scoot you a little closer. And
Great,
be less
thank you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, for the moment, yeah.
And it also might be helpful if you actually take off your earbuds and just talk to your computer, so have your sound direct. That might be more helpful too. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try and point it directly towards me as much as possible. So we've really kind of created a utopian environment for robins that has everything that they need. Plenty of lawns for foraging on worms and invertebrates. A lot of our yards are decorated with ornamental plants. Many of them have fruit. A lot of these are non-native plants. So the holly is a great example of this. It has all these yummy red berries for robins to munch on. Robins aren't necessarily feeder birds, but man, do they enjoy a good bath. Hopefully you guys have all had the pleasure of watching robins enjoying a little afternoon wash inside your all's bird bath. So we put those out in our yards, and robins come for them. And we also provide nesting sites for them. Although robins typically in the natural environment would put their nest in a tree or on a shrubbery, you can see right here, man, the ledge of the building works just fine. So really, robins have adapted to our environment that we have created for them. And there's plenty out there for them to eat, to take a bath, to make babies, and to grow up and be happy, nice robins. So I kind of want to start first with the making babies part. Robins in many parts of the country, and I don't know about up where you guys are, but where I did my dissertation work in Kentucky, they can have 3 clutches in one summer. Usually would lay about 3 to 5 eggs, and usually fledge about 2 juveniles. So pretty successful at rearing young. And they've really adapted to our environment as far as egg laying behavior. So this is work from Turner. He is out of Mark Halber's lab at Southern Illinois University. And they did a really interesting study looking at latitudinal variation in fitness in robins. And in general, robins about 30% nest success overall. But they saw this really kind of interesting variation that the further northerly latitudes you go, they might not have as many clutches as say we do in Kentucky, but they have much higher nest success and have larger clutches. And this is important to think about when we think about climate change. If robin's range is going to shift further and further north, well, maybe they won't be able to have as many clutches in one breeding season, but nest success might be higher. So their overall fitness might actually be the same. So showing some of that adaptability in their breeding behavior. Another interesting thing about the robin in relation to their breeding behavior is they've done pretty well in comparison to some other species that haven't when we talk about birds that are also spreading. So here's a beautiful female brown cowbird. Of course, they don't like to take care of their young. They love to dump their eggs into other birds' nests. And the robin is a rejector. And so a lot of folks are really interested in what about the robin makes them reject eggs, whereas other birds do not. And this is more work out of Mark Halber's lab doing some really cool and interesting stuff. So here is a picture of a robin investigating the nest, and one of those things doesn't belong, and a robin knows it. But a lot of other bird species, they'll take that and they'll raise it, even though it's not their own. So they've done investigations trying to understand why the robin rejects eggs and kind of what signals does the robin use. The robin's highly visual, so it's likely that it's the spotting on the eggs as well as the coloration. And that's kind of the signal that they use to, hey, that's not mine, and they get rid of that cowbird egg. So they don't have to worry about nest parasites like some other birds do. And this is also a really kind of cool and interesting thing out of Halber's lab that they found. One year early in the nesting season, they found about 25 nests on the ground. So normally, as I said, robins, where you should find them is nesting in the trees or in shrubbery. But these birds were nesting on the ground. And their thought was that maybe the robins were building the nest on the ground because it is colder. And the insulation factor was warmer close to the ground than up in the trees when all the foliage hadn't come in and a lot of wind blowing around. And these nests actually did just as well as any of the nests that were placed up in the trees. Once again, kind of showing you that adaptability of robins when it comes to creating nests and making babies. Very, very successful. Those babies eventually will fledge, and they're pretty demanding and need to eat a lot. This is what I focused a lot of my dissertation research on, was trying to look at how do little robins become big robins and how are they different from their parents. They aren't as good as adults when it comes to foraging for invertebrates, but they do get there, and they get there pretty quickly. I mean, if you think about it, for robins, especially those that migrate, they need to learn how to forage on their own really, really quickly. Robins have a interesting diet where they don't only feed on invertebrates, but they also feed on a lot of fruit. And fruit for robins is a really important resource, especially during migration and over winter. So for juvenile birds, this is a really important skill to learn. And traditionally, when you think about foraging for fruit, right, it's just there. You just pick it off, put it in your beak and swallow it. How hard can that be? Especially in comparison to something like, hey, I've got to grab a worm out of the soil and be able to eat that. But baby robins are not as good as adults when foraging for fruit. And this is going to kind of lead me to my next subject I want to talk about, and how robins are kind of changing the landscape. So it's not just us that are changing the landscape. Robins are also changing the landscape in how they disperse fruit in the environment. And so this figure here is from a paper out of Europe looking at seed dispersal in another thrush species, Turdus marula. And when you think about birds foraging in the environment, they do it at different scales, and they have effects at different scales. So a robin, as it's flying overhead, it might be looking at the larger landscape and might find these little patches of trees where there's different color fruits, different types of fruit. And one big signal that seems to indicate, hey, this is where I want to dive down and start chunking down on different types of fruit, is crop size. And once they have these different fruits, they might go from tree to tree and feed on different types of fruit. And then they're going to leave those trees and they're going to fly off into the environment. And of course, as they fly off into the environment and go to new places, they're going to be dispersing those seeds in the environment. This is also a study out of Europe. And when we talk about seed dispersal, it's really important that those seeds move as far away from the parent plant as possible and into new and favorable environments. And generally mammals do a better job because they can disperse seeds further many times, and also larger seeds they can disperse further away. But medium-sized birds, especially thrushes, a lot of studies have shown that they are capable of dispersing seeds over 500 meters, and that's a pretty good distance away from the parent plant. And so here's a study, and this was with this missile thrush, showing that they are capable of dispersing seeds long distance. So this brings us back to the robin, which does eat a lot of fruit. And it not only eats native fruits, but it also eats invasive fruits. So here, this was a study where they basically were capturing Lonicera, honeysuckle seeds and fruit from robins. And they wanted to kind of capture these seeds and then see how many of those seeds are viable. And not only with robins, but a lot of other birds, once they swallow those seeds, they actually germinate better after they've had that kind of gut treatment. So robins are really important and very effective seed dispersers. So here, just showing you kind of a comparison with other species. Waxwings are also phenomenal seed dispersers, but robins rank right up there. In comparison to waxwings, sometimes they just nibble on the fruits, whereas robins, because of their gait, can actually gulp a lot of fruits and eat the seeds whole. I've done some work on seed dispersal. I'm down here in Florida. We have a fruit called the camphor fruit from the camphor tree, which was introduced to Florida so that they could get the camphor oil. Of course, like all invasive plant species, it's spread everywhere. And camphor fruit is dark, kind of bluish purple in color. And studies have shown that birds like dark colored fruit. So if a robin is flying overhead and sees this large fruit crop of dark colored fruit, it's naturally going to be attracted to it. Robins can feed on this fruit, whether they are perched in the tree, or oftentimes they'll kind of fly by and just grab a piece of fruit off the wing. And they can consume over 2 pieces of fruit, which means they're removing 2 seeds per minute. Robins disperse a lot of invasive plant seeds. My colleague, Jeremy Wrench, he's in South Carolina. We just did a review paper, kind of trying to understand what do we know about seed dispersal by birds in native plants and invasive plants. And this was just done in the Southeast. And a lot of the literature out there, people that work on invasive plants, they say, well, it was dispersed by birds. And we know it's dispersed by birds, but they haven't actually investigated, well, which birds are doing the dispersal? How is this dispersal process happening? But in the papers that we did find that did mention specific birds, the robin is right up there, and it's constantly mentioned, likely because of its highly frugivorous diet. So these are just some kind of foraging rates that I've taken from different studies that I've done. And in all these, you see, it's about, 2 pieces of fruit per minute. And we're talking about 1 bird here. And robins, especially in the winter, I don't know how they are up where you are, but in Kentucky, man, ginormous foraging flocks. Down here in Florida, you see them in these really large foraging flocks, just going after fruit and then taking off and then moving off to the next area and going after fruit. So if you've got this really massive, very large foraging flock, let's just say, for example, you have maybe 100 birds, right? So that means in 1 minute or so, they're removing about 200 pieces of fruit. Well, if they're in that foraging patch for about 20 minutes, that can be as many as 4,000 seeds that can be taken. And especially when robins are kind of in that migratory mood, they're foraging and then they're moving on. They're foraging and they're moving on. So they have a huge capacity for moving seeds across the environment, and something that I really think should be investigated more. All right, so this is kind of what I've talked about so far. Excuse my language there, but robins really know how to do what they do. They've kind of moved in. They've made themselves right at home. Our backyards are a smorgasbord, and their poop just spreads stuff pretty much everywhere. So next, I'm going to kind of shift over to talking about kind of some of their anti-predator behaviors. And once again, robins are highly adaptable. So robins have three types of basic alarm calls. They have a really high-pitched seat alarm call, which is an aerial alarm call. And then they've got their kind of yeeps and chucks that they do in various orders, depending on the severity of the predator. So you guys have probably all heard robins out there on the yeep, chuck, 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 yeep, chuck, 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 or yeep, 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 chuck, 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 yeep, chuck, chuck, chuck. So I'm sure you guys have heard all these, but I'll play them for you. Hopefully you can hear them. And these are all kind of cut up, so you might not be able to hear them too well. And in grad school, I also investigated their alarm calls. And in particular, I was interested in this really high-pitched aerial alarm call, this high-pitched seat call, and was looking at how juveniles compared to adults when they hear this high-pitched alarm call. And once again, juveniles aren't quite as good as adults at picking up this alarm signal. They tend to be really alert when they hear that, but they don't engage in a very typical behavior that robins engage in when they hear these high-pitched seat calls. And many of you all might have seen this before, but if there's a lot of robins giving kind of the aerial alarms, they'll kind of scrunch their whole body down and twitch their head up, and they just kind of freeze and stare up at the sky. And so we kind of call this sky gazing behavior. And if you create these really high rates of seat calls, just one after another, then they really are like, oh crap, something really bad is happening. And the juveniles, they don't quite understand yet, but they get there. I've done a couple other investigations of robin alarm calls, and my PhD advisor, Perry Eason, has also investigated how robins kind of react to predators. And one way you can study predators and how animals might react to them is, well, how do they react to humans? And robins know humans, and they know when humans should be there and when humans shouldn't be there. And as I said, they've got kind of two types of kind of terrestrial alarm calls, these yeeps and chucks, and they put them together in all sorts of kind of different ways to send signals like, man, things are really bad, or they're not so bad. And usually those yeeps are more like, oh crap, it's not good. But the chucks are kind of like, chuck, 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 like, okay, this isn't a good situation. So I did a study where basically I approached nests in two different types of environments. One was out in kind of the wooded area away from humans. And then the other was when robins built their nests close to human buildings or even on human buildings. Well, how would they respond to me as I approached them? And basically I recorded their calls and then just counted the numbers of yeeps and chucks that they gave. And sure enough, if you're out in the middle of the woods, robins are like, whoa, this is my turf. You shouldn't be here. Get away from my nest. They give a lot more yeeps and chucks in response to approaching the nest. Whereas if you're near a building, it makes sense. They nest on the buildings quite a bit. Let's not freak out over seeing a human pass by, because they pass by all the time. Similarly, flight initiation distance, and this is something a lot of researchers have used to engage kind of fear of predators in birds and in other animals. And basically you just kind of walk towards the bird. When does it say like, I see you? And then when does it fly off? And so you have two things, alert distance and then this flight initiation distance, when they actually take off. And my PhD advisor, Perry Eason, she studied flight initiation distances when robins were out in the middle of the field or when they were on a human pathway. And once again, we see differences between juveniles and adults. So that's what these two different bar colors are for us. So the juveniles are black bars. They fly off a lot quicker than adults do. But we see differences given these two different environments. If you're in the grass, robins don't expect you to be there. But if you're on a pathway, that's where robins think you should be. So we've got smaller flight initiation distances, meaning you can get closer to them when you're walking on a path and there's also a robin on the path. But if you're in a field, not where a human should be while I'm out foraging, they'll fly away. So this brings me to kind of the final thing is, well, how do robins put up with all this pollution that we put out in our environment? And this could be a whole separate talk. all sorts of pollution, noise pollution. This is kind of my biggest pet peeve out there, especially these damn leaf blowers that are going all the time. Light pollution, and then actual chemical pollution in our environment. How are robins dealing with it? Or how can robins tell us, hey, something really bad is going on, we should be wary. So first, light pollution. Robins aren't the only birds that have adjusted to us putting more light into our environment. This happens with lots of birds. Their chorus is changing as we've got all these artificial lights out. They think it's, daytime, time to start singing, time to start impressing the ladies. So the time at which they sing in the morning has gotten much earlier than what it was in the past. What about chemical pollutants? And this was a kind of sad but interesting story that came out of Flint, Michigan. So they wanted to test mercury levels in robins and look at body condition. Of course, we all know about Flint, Michigan, and the dangerous chemicals in their water up there. And as you can see, so here the irrigated Flint area, these had very high amounts of heavy metals of lead, which we all know it's not good for you. And you can see in the robin, overall body condition was much lower in these areas that had high amounts of lead. So because robins are so connected to us and they live in our neighborhoods, if our neighborhoods are polluted, the robins are also going to be feeling and being affected by this pollution. Noise pollution, my gosh, it is so noisy out there. I hope it's quieter up where you guys live than down here in Florida where I live. A lot of scientists have investigated noise pollution, and we see this common trend where many birds have to change how they sing in these noisy environments because of these really low frequencies. You've got your leaf blowers going, your cars, your jets. And birds, if their songs are down there, nobody's going to hear them. So they raise them up. But these are songs. People haven't been paying as much attention to the calls that birds make, which are just as important. And so I mentioned those yeeps and those chucks just a little while ago. And some of these happen, especially these chucks happen at these lower frequencies. And they're more likely to be masked by things like leaf blowers and so forth. So hopefully you guys can hear this. But this is a recording. Oh. But it's a little hard, might be hard for you guys to hear, but you can see on this sonogram, and I just downloaded these from Xenopanto, at these lower frequencies, especially these chucks seem to be kind of covered up. So how are the robins going to adjust to this? And one thing I'm very interested in doing is measuring not just bird songs, but bird calls. And are they shifting the frequency up so that they can be heard? Or are they maybe not using as many chucks? And maybe they're using more yeeps because yeeps can get above that barrier. Another possibility is that robins are switching the signals that they send. If you can't hear somebody, well, maybe you can see them. And a lot of animals use what we call multimodal signals. So instead of just giving a vocalization, I also give a physical display as well. And one thing robins will do, and many of you all might have seen this, is when they're giving their alarms, especially when they give their little chucks, they'll kind of wag their tail a little bit. So they might go yeep, but then when they do the chucks, they'll kind of wag their tail. And some work has been done on this already, not in birds, but in squirrels. So squirrels, when they make their, you'll hear it all the times when you're walking in the woods and there's some squirrel that's not too happy. So this is a vocalization that they can give, a predator vocalization, but it's kind of lower frequency. But they also flick their tail a lot, which is a visual signal. And studies have shown in noisy environments, they do more of the tail flagging than they do of the, because it's noisy. Nobody can hear you. So if you can't hear me, well, maybe you'll be able to see my signal. And they've done some really cool things. They actually created little robot squirrels that could like flag their tail back and forth to study this. And I did some preliminary work with this in grad school and it went nowhere, but it's one of those questions that's like stuck in the back of my head and is driving me crazy. Because I do think, in fact, robins, maybe they've already switched how they do this. And maybe that's why when they give their chucks, they kind of flap their tail more than when they give their yeeps. So that's one thing that I really want to investigate in the future is how are they changing their behavior to compensate for this noisy environment that unfortunately we all have to live in now. So I think the robin, hopefully I've given you guys some examples of how the robin can be a sign of hope for us in our climate as it is changing. The robin really has adapted to everything that we have thrown at it. There are lots and lots of robins, and robins is one of those groups of birds that, you know, we're not too concerned about. There's a very healthy population. There's over 350 million robins out there. They're doing just fine. But I think it's a great bird to study to figure out, well, what is this bird doing that they are so successful? And more importantly, as I said in the beginning, I really think the robin is just a great bird of hope and a great bird that people can connect with, even if they aren't birders. It's a bird that you see every single day. And unfortunately, I think a lot of us kind of get this what I like to call the Dorothy syndrome. We like all these exotic things or these rare birds, you know, we always go chasing after them. But unfortunately, sometimes we overlook the common birds that are doing some really cool and interesting things. And I love robins. So if you guys have any questions about robins, I'd be happy to answer them. But thank you guys for letting me talk about robins for a while.
Right. Well, thank you, Professor Vanderhoff. And a few people have posted questions in the chat column, and then I've got a few questions of my own, but I'll go to the audience first, and we'll see how long we can keep you here before we finally let you leave.
I love robins. They're amazing birds. They're overlooked. I just, you know, and I'm guilty of it myself. I used to overlook them all the time, but I miss them now so much.
Yeah. By the way, you were wondering at the beginning of your talk how cold it was up here. So I took a quick look, and at the time you were starting the program, it was 13 degrees here in Amherst. And that's not counting the wind chill factor. After the wind chill, it's 2 degrees. Oh,
I'm not going to tell you how cold I am here and what the temperature is, because you guys might just click me off and be done with me.
Okay, first question is from, we had an audience member watching from Southwest Florida, who is wondering about said they don't personally see many robins down where they live, and they're wondering how common or rare robins are in the southwestern part of Florida.
They don't go really, really far south. In Florida, in the area where I am, Northeast Florida, you see them. You do get some down there during migration, but not a lot. But as far as numbers that are down there, I'm not exactly positive. Up here in Northeast Florida, we get them in large flocks in the winter, but I'm not too sure how far south they go. But there's plenty of fruit down there for them. So they might.
Okay, and we have one person applauding your use of a quote from Emily Dickinson, because our club is based in Amherst, where Emily Dickinson lived for quite a while, and so
well, hope is a feather. So
yeah, she has a big fan following around here. Okay, related to the last question about robins, how widespread they are in North and South. Someone was wondering about the robins here in Western Massachusetts, where they, first off, I guess how many of them remain here year round, where the robins that are present here for the breeding season go, like how far away they travel in the winter, and the robins that overwinter here, how far away are they coming from? Where is the breeding range of our wintering robins?
I do not know specifically where your robins come or go from. As I said, this is something that biologists are still trying to figure out. We've got some data from banding stations in the past, but especially because we do have a lot of these robins that don't seem to migrate. They might move away from their breeding territory, but not by much. They're still in the general vicinity. And that's what Brown's study kind of showed, is that they aren't going long distances. They aren't migrating long distances. But as far as the connectivity and where your populations are going or coming from, I'd have to go back and look at the map. And I can pull that up and we can kind of check it out. But off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly where each robin population comes from.
I know one local one of the most hardcore birders around here, a gentleman named James Smith, who's moved here from Great Britain and who leads birding tours internationally. He, on at least one occasion, found a robin from a subspecies that breeds in Newfoundland, which was, I guess, as robin subspecies go, the Newfoundland subspecies is fairly distinct and, relatively easier to pick out of the crowd than some of the other robins. I've tried looking for these Newfoundland robins, and the differences are still subtle, but
yeah, I wouldn't be able to pick one out probably. Yeah, no, I mean the as I said in the beginning, they're known for their migratory behavior. You would think we would have figured this out by now, but we haven't, and because they are changing their behavior to be non-migratory in some instances, or shifting how and when they migrate, it's still a picture that we're trying to figure out. So,
and I know James is actually married to a UMass professor, Susanna Lerman, who I believe was banding robins in this area. So if she comes back, maybe if she comes back at some point, we could see if she's had any of her banded robins recovered from other parts of the country.
Yeah, and I know when we banded, when I was in grad school, we banded over 200 robins, and then they would just disappear, and we never heard back from where they were going. We did find some that we banded and they stayed in the vicinity, but the large majority of them just went off, and we had no clue where they were going. So I'm really looking forward to Emily's work that she's doing and seeing what she comes up with as far as kind of what robins are doing in lots of distinct areas across our country.
Excellent. All right, one question which may be a little out of your wheelhouse. Someone who wanted to know about populations here in Western Massachusetts, saying they don't see robins in their area and wondering if we've had any population declines here, which Western Massachusetts has a relatively much sparser population than further east around Boston or Worcester.
Yeah.
And so maybe something more general, like as robins increase in kind of suburban and more populated areas, how does this affect the robin populations in the more kind of deep woodsy areas?
That's what I would say is probably they're more abundant in suburban areas where we've created this nice utopian landscape for them where they've got everything they need. But in the past, if we were to take a time machine back into kind of more natural woodland areas, they're found in these openings kind of in the forest and forest edge environments. And there probably weren't as abundant as they are now. And we created this artificial habitat that creates a lot of these edges and a lot of foraging opportunities for them. So probably not seeing as many in that area because the landscape hasn't been altered for them, as you were saying. That would be my best guess.
Yeah, and then someone else kind of chimed in response to this question, noting that our local Christmas bird count, the Northampton Christmas bird count, still tallies American robin as one of the 3 most abundant species on the count. A fair amount of that is some of the local birders, I think, have identified the kind of large communal roost site where many of the robins gather around here in the winter, and so they can get like a count like the big mass count of the robins coming into the roost in the evening.
Yeah, those roosts can be ginormous. Those roosts are, talk about another vocalization that's so much fun, that chattering they make when they all come down to the roost. I mean, I don't know, it's enjoyable to listen to when they're all up there. It's like, what are they talking about? I picture them saying, get out of my way, this is my branch. No, I want to sit.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I know at least one of the compilers of that Christmas count is in the audience, so maybe they'll want to chime in about the general numbers, like how many thousands of robins get tallied from the count from year to year. We have one question on a different tack, asking about the foraging behavior and about the ways in which the robins, like which senses robins use to hunt for earthworms and other kind of invertebrate or even vertebrate prey. I know I've seen pictures of robins eating small snakes and such. So which other senses do the robins rely on most for prey detection?
It's usually vision. And if I was there, I could act out my little robin kind of foraging behavior, but you'll see them, they'll be like scurrying along, scamping, and then they kind of turn their head. And the thought is they're looking, they're turning so their eyes can see that food item. Early on, it was thought that maybe they were, when they turn their head like that, maybe they are listening for earthworms and things like that. They might be able to pick up some of those vibrations, and even the moving with their paws maybe might. And some work's been done on this here in Florida, where movements in the sand and so forth causes worms to kind of come closer to the surface, so that then if they see some, and then they can dive down and they kind of do like a bill pounce to go for it. And some of that bill pounce initially might just be getting some tactile information, is there an earthworm there? But definitely for smaller invertebrates that they're feeding in the lawns and grass, which they do feed on a lot of other insects and things, they'll, look and then grab, and then you'll see them munching away in their beak.
Okay, we have a question, next question that came up, which I think you addressed somewhat in your talk earlier, but if you want to go into more in depth on it, asking the changes in robin migratory patterns and how much more sedentary are they now as compared to 50 or 100 years ago?
I think they are becoming less migratory. In large part, they don't need to move. They've got everything that they need in these suburban areas that we have created for them. We've created shelter, we've created plenty of food for them. And it seems, or it appears, that they're becoming less migratory than they used to be. I'm really interested in seeing what Emily and her data that she comes out with, because hopefully she'll be able to answer some of these questions. Are we seeing more robins kind of staying put? Or is it just in certain areas that we're seeing robins stay put? His work kind of shows that it's kind of this middle swath. And then high up north and down south, we still have large migratory groups, but maybe there's this swath kind of in the middle of the country. Maybe if conditions are just right, maybe temperature and so forth, and maybe not too much snow in these areas. Maybe these are areas where robins can stay year round and have plenty of foraging opportunities. But once again, I would say they're staying put more, but I don't know if anybody has actually done definitive research to show that for sure.
Okay, next up, we have someone who wants to talk about you've talked about robins and their tendency to disperse the seeds of non-native plants. And so someone asked about bringing, okay, first off, before I get further into that, one of our Christmas bird count compilers was ready to comment about Christmas bird count robin numbers here in Massachusetts, how many we've gotten recently, and maybe how they've changed over the years. So Janice, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I took a random look in like 2002 to 2004. We had like in the 700s. In 2007 to 2011, it dropped to 400 to 500. In 2016, we had 1,700. And in 2020, we had, it's like 600. But this year we had a robin roost with over 5,000.
Oh,
Okay, so yeah, it's all kind of big difference on whether we find that roosting location.
And that it's in the count circle.
Oh, right, because if they roost but it's outside the circle, then it doesn't affect the numbers.
Somebody might be able to talk about the roost that was over, I think, in Whately, where there were like 10,000. Mary Alice probably knows that there was like thousands and thousands.
Ah, excellent. All right.
There were 10,000 there. You're quite right. That was the best estimate we could do, but obviously we didn't count right down to the last bird. That was in an abandoned Christmas tree farm. And it was abandoned because they'd let the trees grow too large. And the robins loved it. But then so did the owls. So, you know.
I guess, Professor Vanderhoff, do you know about when the robins are gathering in these kind of massive winter roosts? Do you know much about the issue of predation on the roosts, and how frequently do the robins have to relocate their roost site in response to predators gathering? Any ideas?
I have no idea. I haven't seen any published data on it, but there's safety in numbers. So I imagine, especially if you've got 10,000 robins, an individual robin's probably chances of getting picked off are probably pretty small, but I haven't seen anything out there. It would be interesting to see if rates go up as the flock size increase. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, that would be definitely interesting to know. Okay, back to the issue someone wanted to raise earlier, that if robins are spreading lots of non-native plant species, how possible is it to plant native species and to try to convince them to be spreading natives as opposed to non-natives? Which I know I had a friend in North Carolina who did some research and discovered that the non-native plants tended to have higher sugar content in their fruit, and so tended to be preferred by cedar waxwings and such over the native species. That I believe he found that the nutrition content was higher in the native species, but the sugar content was lower. So the non-native species were like potato chips, and the native species were more like carrot sticks. Do you any comments on sort of native plant species that can be used to feed robins and try to lure them away from the non-natives?
Obviously, it's always best to plant natives over non-natives, and the studies out on fruit preference for native versus non-native, it's been mixed. Some studies show they like the non-natives, but other studies show that they actually do prefer the native fruits. So you'll read different things, and especially when these studies are done in all different parts of the country, you might find different results. Some folks are, non-natives, they aren't great, but if robins are foraging on non-native plants, if there are native plants nearby that also have a somewhat large crop, right? When they're making their decision to fly in, they're seeing that crop size. And so you might have kind of these neighborhood effects where, yeah, they're dispersing non-native seeds, but if there's natives nearby, they're probably also offering dispersal services to native plants. And of course, the big thing is eradication and planting more natives. But in many places, we're kind of beyond that. But I mean, they still do disperse native plants for sure. And even when they're dispersing non-natives, they probably are also dispersing natives. But the proportion and the frequency, we don't really know. You know, that's one thing doing this review paper. There have been so few studies in the States, really kind of complex studies on seed dispersal and seed dispersal dynamics, that a lot of these things we really haven't figured out kind of all the seed dispersal networks and what's the proportion of native versus non-native and where are these seeds going in the environment and how are they altering the landscape. These are some things that we just don't know yet, but are very important questions to answer.
Okay, and we had one local person who wanted to maybe chime in on the issue before we get back to you. Stella, are you out there and you wanted to talk about native plantings?
Yeah, it's
oh, Henry, that's you.
yeah. I have a lot of I have robins all year long, particularly in the winter, and they go for the crab apples partly, but I've also planted a lot of American spicebush, black haw viburnum, arrowwood viburnum. There's a bunch of plants that will attract robins, and cedar waxwings too. So I highly recommend just planting native plants that have berries, you know, and the birds will come in. They also come in and eat a lot of sumac. It's sort of their starvation food, but this time of year, that's what they're filling up on, and they're spreading those seeds everywhere too. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Henry. Okay, I had a couple of, we're through most of the questions in the chat. I had a couple of my own, some of which kind of related to these issues. So Natasha, I'm wondering, I know at least in some parts of the country, there are types of fruit, especially holly berries, that tend to be less edible early in the winter before the temperature has gotten really cold. But then after a couple of cycles of freezing and thawing, these fruit become more, I guess, more palatable and get consumed more by the kind of wandering robin hordes. Do you know much about this system and about how the robins distinguish when the hollies and fruits like this are palatable? Are they kind of sampling the fruit all along, or do they track the weather and change their feeding habits in response to kind of the cold snaps or freezing snaps? Any ideas?
I don't know if they're tracking the weather. I could imagine the robins testing the fruit out. I mean, they use color as an indication of ripeness, and if they, you know, go down and the fruit doesn't seem like it's ready or it's ripe, it's not ready to be pulled off the tree, or it doesn't have that right kind of sugar to lipid content that they need, they're probably going to go elsewhere. But can they track the change in weather to know, hey, this is going to be the moment that stuff tastes really good? I have no idea. I wouldn't put it past them, but but yeah, that would be interesting.
This is a future research project for somebody. Okay, let's see. The other questions I had mostly related to the alarm calls and changes that the robins exhibited around humans and human residences. I guess one being when the robins, like you mentioned, the robins use the alarm calls less often in response to humans when the robins are nesting near a house or in a human neighborhood. Do they still call at the same frequency in response to other non-human predators, or are their alarm calls reduced in general?
I did not measure their response to, you know, say chipmunks or raccoons, or if a blue jay was coming near the nest. So I'm not positive. In general, in urban environments, you usually have fewer predators than you do out in the wild for them. But I would think their response to a predator that they know is a real predator would be just as high. So I would think if it's a blue jay coming to the nest or a chipmunk coming to the nest, they would respond pretty aggressively. I think just with humans, they know we're no big deal. We're supposed to be going into our garage. We're supposed to be passing by to get into this building. So I think that's habituating to human presence.
That would make, I know I've read some studies of mammals showing that the mammals had very specific alarm calls in response to different types of predators. And I think some even with response to individual humans, some of these mammals had different calls for different human individuals. So it wouldn't surprise me if the robins are have a very species specific anti-predator response.
No,
Let's see, and then related, I know, do you know anything about, you mentioned that the predators are less abundant in human neighborhoods, and there's also different types of predators and mortality causes. We've had a couple speakers come in talking about window strikes and cat predation and such. Do you know anything about overall mortality of robins in less developed areas where they're mainly threatened by predators versus human inhabited areas where they have kind of domestic pets and windows and such that they have to worry about?
Yeah, the window strike data, it's interesting. Different studies, robins aren't up there at the top of the list in some studies for window strikes, but in certain areas, they're the highest bird on the list. So there seems to be kind of geographical and seasonal variation for when you get window strikes with robins, especially when you've got manicured lawns next to areas that have highly reflective surfaces. There tends to be a lot of strikes in those instances. As far as studies that have looked at predation kind of in areas that are more wildland versus suburban areas, I don't know if there has been a study conducted to kind of compare, say, nest predation in these two areas. I would guess that it would be higher in the more natural areas. Of course, cats are, the number one killer out there. I don't know how they are up in your area, but down here in Florida, they are everywhere, and they're really, really bad, especially because we don't get those really cold freezes and cold temperatures like you do. So I can imagine probably cat predation is probably pretty bad on robins in areas where you have large amounts of feral cats. But that's another thing that hasn't been thoroughly investigated in the U.S. In our region, at least in Florida, it hasn't been studied quite as much. Not as much as out in Britain. They've done lots and lots of work tracking feral cats in neighborhoods and kind of where they go and what they feed on. They've done some really kind of cool modeling stuff, but all that stuff's over in Britain. I'm not as familiar with the stuff here in the States.
Yeah, I know up here in we not only have kind of pretty brutal cold and deep snow at times up here in Massachusetts that knocks the feral cat populations down. We also have a pretty healthy coyote population around here. And so in Western Massachusetts, at least, the cats have have their own predators to worry about that, has sort of a beneficial effect on the birds.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Down here in Florida, whenever there are coyotes, people freak out because they're worried about their dogs and their kids. And unfortunately, the coyotes go faster than the feral cats do, which is sad, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. I have one last question. And if there's anyone else in the audience who has a question they haven't asked yet, this is your last chance to get in before we say goodnight to Dr. Vanderhoff. So, and my last one, about as the robins in like human neighborhoods kind of alter their patterns of alarm calls and sort of anti-predator behavior, is there any sign that, and the populations you noted in these kind of human developed areas are kind of booming and are really healthy, is there any sign of the changes in behavior spreading out of human neighborhoods into kind of adjoining, say, forest fragments or such, or are the changes very kind of locally specific only to kind of our yards and neighborhoods and they don't spread out?
I don't know if anybody has done research on this, but my guess is that it would be very localized because those behaviors are adapted in that environment and in that situation. And robins that don't migrate and tend to stick to neighborhoods, they really don't go that far. They're not going to go off into, say, the woods or a natural environment. And vice versa, I can't really see more, woodland robins kind of moving into areas that are more suburban. A good way to kind of test that is kind of on the edge, sometimes what they call these, I think now they're calling it ex-suburban, these newly developed areas where they're freshly taking down the forest and putting new houses up in new neighborhoods. That would be an interesting kind of environment to test and see, well, how do robins behave there versus in a well-established neighborhood? How are those behaviors different? And that would be one way of kind of getting at that.
And it sounds from your descriptions like the robins are kind of, like a lot of these behaviors are not sort of heavily genetically ingrained, that to grace the robins are just highly intelligent and kind of alter their behaviors based on what environment they happen to find themselves in from year to year.
Yeah, I mean, it might just be that they're just more plastic in their behavior and they're more capable of engaging in novel behavior. And these novel behaviors, if they're adaptive, are going to be, selected for. But once again, we don't know.
All right, then. Well, it looks like the flow of new questions has trickled down to a stop. So this is a point where with a live audience, we would give you a standing ovation in response to your talk. And we don't have that option so much, but we'd like to thank you very much. It was an excellent, there we go for some of the ovation happening. Thank you very much it was a wonderful program.
Well, thank you guys, and please stay warm up there. You all are making me cold just thinking about those temperatures.
You're not the only one. All right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Good night, and thanks to everybody for showing up for the program.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, guys. Stay warm.